Hi, my name's Kevin Kasaven. I'm back. And thank you for your patience today. Some minor technical issues, but we're back on track. I'm here presenting on the Positive Practice Audit, and I'm not going to share any slides or any of the report itself on the screen, but essentially I believe it's in the portal for you to look at, and if I was to try and read to it, it would just be boring, so I want to try and be inspiring about how I present on it. So essentially, we were inspired to do this audit because A, there's never been one of its kind. And B, we felt that rather than trying to do learning from a suicide, we wanted to do learning from best practice, which stopped people feeling that way. And the thing about publishing, it's really difficult to publish things around suicide. But if you're publishing best practice, no brainer, fairly easy, and we can celebrate our success in helping people to think differently about their feelings and to find different strategies. So essentially, we were tasked with the first time of its kind to think about how we can actually celebrate best practice. So the network met, and in about sort of November time last year, as we did our first kind of real launch of the network, we kind of challenged the network and said, come on, let's put heads together and let's pull together a core group of colleagues from different agencies that can then think about how we prevented young people, young adults from feeling the way they have been. And we identified a number of colleagues that day who stepped forward. This was additional work. They weren't given time off from their work. They did it on top of their day-to-day work. And they had young people in mind that they could safely say, do you know what, we tried something and it made a difference. In talking to those agencies, we then pulled them together in a core group. We had terms of reference. And what ended up happening was that it was difficult to do data analysis. I think if any of you know about trying to amalgamate data, it's next to impossible. You can't bring people's data together and amalgamate it and make it make sense. So that had to be a task we had to kind of give up on. It was something that was taking up a lot of time and resource. So essentially what we did, we identified young people from that terms of reference. The first step was to identify young people that were looked after, that were care leavers. We felt care leavers were the best one to look at. It was a main emphasis because we'd had experiences of 3 care leavers committing suicide in just following the pandemic starting. And so we felt it was a worthwhile exercise to look at how care leavers have been supported in the past. So we went through the exercise of identifying from Kent and Medway a number of young people that had experienced suicidal ideation but had been supported to avoid those feelings. And so what eventually happened was that we identified 3 young people that were care leavers who in 2019, we didn't want to go too recent because they might still be raw. And we also wanted to make sure that they had the experience of those services for a long enough period of time that they weren't feeling that way. And we also wanted to have the opportunity to meet with those young people in order to get some feedback because we wanted to make their voice come alive. Within this whole kind of audit, it's important to hear from young people about how they experience their services. So it would be really empowering for other young people who might feel the same way to read this document and think, other young people have actually said this is what's helped for them, maybe it'll help for me. So we identified 3 young people. We had to make sure those care leavers were also touching points with the other agencies that were involved in the audit. And we were then able to then create an audit tool. Now the audit tool took us couple of sessions to meet up with each other and go through it, but we agreed on a specific audit tool. And all the questions were quantitative based as best we can, but largely there's a lot of qualitative things to be taken. And so some of the learning for our next audit is to be a lot more quantitative so we can start to unpick some of the data. But the reality is you're never going to be able to look at enough young people to make definitive conclusions. All we can do is suggest and highlight what we've experienced and just be suggestive about what our findings have found. And we believe our findings are powerful. So essentially, after the audit, within the audit, we tried to meet with the young people. It was really difficult, even though they had positive outcomes, to then go back to the young people and then ask, how do you interpret services? Whilst they were safe, much more better places, for a lot of those young people, they didn't want to give us some feedback. So it wasn't a negative in our view. We felt that there was in that. And if that's what people were happy with, that's the most important thing. That's what we went by. So essentially, I'm talking about, I'm just going to scroll down and look through the report myself briefly. But essentially what we found was that young people were responded to immediately with the risk. That was, of course, a naturally positive. But it wasn't about introducing new services to young people. What we found overwhelmingly was that it was the relationships that they already had with multi-agency, which made it really powerful. And for a couple of young people, They didn't actually want to be engaged in a complex arena or clinical setting. So for one or two of the young people, they went to meet with NELFT, or they met with some sort of counsellor or in adult services, but actually they found it quite intimidating. And for care leavers especially, you have to remember some of those care leavers might have been in care for a couple of months to a couple of years, but some of them might have spent a good 10 to 15 years in care. And so they were quite seasoned professionals. So for them, the clinical setting wasn't the right place for them to be able to talk about their feelings. So a lot of what happened was that the initial feeling of feeling suicidal or wanting to hurt themselves, it led to multi-agency that were already involved with the young person coming together to say, let's learn about what we already know and build on that, and talk to the young person to hear their views. So overwhelmingly, young people that had had the chance to express themselves, especially in multi-agency meetings, like actual joint meetings where they're not being spoken about, but actually engage with the meeting, that was found to be powerful in them finding their voice and thinking about how people view them and understanding why they're worried about them, and give them a chance to articulate their own risks and to say, hang on a minute, you're worried about this, but I'm not worried about it. And it helped to understand mitigating risks, mitigating factors, but also helped to understand what we perceive to be a risk wasn't even really a risk. So it was a bit of a catch-22. But essentially, the multi-agency setting of people already involved was positive. Young people meeting with experts was quite threatening. They didn't find that helpful. But what was really powerful were these kind of chat lines and text messaging systems and all these kind of, like, you'd almost say faceless, but there was someone on the end of the line. And young people overwhelmingly found it powerful to be able to have something that they could reach at all hours of the night. And where we found good practice was that young people would share these resources beforehand as part of their planning. And then when they had those trigger moments, sometimes young people were spoken to about their trigger moments. They developed some sort of identity with it and understood what their trigger moments were. They then didn't have to wait until the day after to speak to their colleagues or their allocated worker. They'd ring up or get in touch with Samaritans or any other wellbeing services and just talk to someone there and then. And then the next day they'd tell their allocated worker how that worked, and it worked really well. So what we found is a lot of these things that Tim and his team with CCG have been commissioning, some over a number of years, were actually being used and preventing young people from taking those next steps. Essentially, what also was really powerful was the university setting. We became to realise it wasn't just about commission services, but other agencies were also offering bespoke support, particularly universities. And we found a number of care leavers that had access services through university to feel more inclusive and to think about how they're feeling. And those were really positive experiences. Fundamentally, what was also a factor which we felt made positive improvements to wellbeing were family relationships. For a number of care leavers, those young people that weren't in contact with their family had some struggles. There were some young people who were in contact with their family, but the struggles that led to them being in care were still there. So the young people were still managing a lot of risks as adults, as young adults, from their parents, but they were finding a way to ameliorate, mediate the risks and make it harmonious, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. So when we found that young people were supported in their relationships with their parents, with their family, that helped promote emotional well-being. So that kind of multi-agency approach involving the young person and helping the young person to think about their relationships with family, even as a young adult, are really powerful and helps young people to think about how they're feeling and to express themselves safely. And the things that we've been able to commission prior to this audit and following appear to be early signs that these are things that are helping young people when we least expect it, actually. And for those young people we spoke to from 2019 having those feelings, overwhelmingly, a lot of them were engaged with educational work in some kind of way, that had their needs met, and they were positively making outcomes, although some of them were quite frail to be able to talk to and ask for feedback, but you could see the positive impact in their lives. Essentially, I'm just going to look at my report again, but from what I can see, you can see the report, the outcomes, and I think I'm going to leave it at this point to kind of, maybe there's some chat in the function that people can ask questions. But essentially, you've got the report, and it's now published. It's been to the main network meeting where it's publishable. So we're going to share this on the KCMP website. The adult services have a website. We're trying to get it out as much as we can. And this is a real positive appraisal, really, of how our interventions work. So I hope you can share it. And I understand it's the first of its kind in the country. So hopefully Tim will better give some feedback about how it's been shared widely. Thank you very much.